At 6:10 on the morning of October 8, 1918, Corporal Alvin York crouched in a muddy shell crater in the Argonne Forest, while German machine gun fire tore through the fog less than 40 yards above his head, and 17 of his friends lay dead or dying in the wire behind him. If you're fascinated by the most unlikely warriors who changed the course of history, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of courage that textbooks forgot. The men of the 82nd Division had laughed when they first saw Alvin York's rifle. It was a Springfield M1903, yes, standard issue, but the way he handled it, the way he cleaned it obsessively every night, the way he sighted down the barrel with a focus that seemed almost spiritual, it all marked him as different, country, backwards, a hillbilly who didn't belong in a modern war. They laughed at his shooting stories, tales of squirrel hunting in the Tennessee mountains where you had to hit the animal in the head to preserve the meat, where a missed shot meant your family went hungry. They laughed at his religious objections, his pacifist beliefs, his initial refusal to fight, and they especially laughed when he tried to explain that his old hunting rifle back home, a muzzle loader his grandfather had used, had taught him more about killing than any machine gun ever could. Alvin York was born on December 13, 1887, in a two-room cabin in Pall Mall, Tennessee, in the Wolf River Valley where the Cumberland Mountains rose steep and unforgiving. He was the third of 11 children born to William and Mary York, subsistence farmers who scratched survival from rocky soil and supplemented their diet with whatever Alvin could shoot. By the age of 8, he was hunting alone. By 12, he could hit a running rabbit at 50 yards. By 15, he was the best shot in Fentress County, and that was saying something in a place where marksmanship wasn't a sport, but a survival skill. The mountains taught him patience. They taught him to read terrain, to move silently, to understand wind and distance and the precise moment when an animal would pause just for a heartbeat and present a clean shot. They taught him that ammunition was precious, that every bullet mattered, that a wasted shot was a moral failing. And they taught him something else, something the Army would later find invaluable. They taught him to shoot moving targets in sequence, to drop multiple birds from a flock by always shooting the ones in the back first, so the ones in front wouldn't spook and scatter. It was a turkey hunter's trick, learned from his father and grandfather. The Army would have called it target prioritization. Alvin just called it common sense. But Alvin York's young life wasn't just mountains and rifles. His father died when Alvin was 24, leaving him as the primary provider for his mother and siblings. The weight of that responsibility, combined with the rough culture of mountain men, led him into drinking, gambling, and bar fights. He was a hellraiser, known throughout the county as someone with a quick temper and faster fists. By his own later admission, he was heading nowhere, wasting his gifts, living without purpose. Then, on January 1, 1915, during a New Year's revival meeting at the Church of Christ in Christian Union, something changed. His friend Everett Delk was killed in a bar fight, and the shock of that senseless death hit Alvin like a physical blow. He walked into that church, angry and lost, and walked out born again, committed to pacifism, to loving his enemies, to never raising his hand in violence again. He threw himself into church work, became a Sunday school teacher, courted a young woman named Gracie Williams with a sincerity that bordered on obsession. The Hellraiser became the most devout man in Pall Mall. So when his draft notice arrived on June 5, 1917, Alvin York faced a crisis that would define his life. America had entered the Great War, and the mountains of Tennessee were being emptied of young men. His church taught that war was murder, that killing under any circumstance was a sin. York requested conscientious objector status, writing on his draft form, "Don't want to fight." The request was denied. His church wasn't on the government's approved list of pacifist denominations. He reported to Camp Gordon in Georgia in November 1917, assigned to Company G, 328th Infantry Regiment, 82nd Division. He was 29 years old, older than most recruits, awkward in formation, uncomfortable with military discipline. But on the rifle range, something changed in how the other men looked at him. York didn't just qualify as a marksman, he shot perfect scores, again and again. At distances that made other men squint and guess, York put rounds through the center of the target with mechanical precision. His company commander, Captain Edward Danforth, Jr., noticed. So did his battalion commander, Major George Edward Buxton. Buxton was a thoughtful man, a student of philosophy and religion. He saw York's torment, the conflict between duty and faith, and he didn't dismiss it. Instead, over several long nights, Buxton and York sat together and discussed the Bible, debated the concept of just war, talked about protecting the innocent versus turning the other cheek. Buxton quoted scripture back at York, passages about soldiers, about authority, about the difference between murder and righteous defense. He gave York a 10-day leave to go home and wrestle with his conscience. York spent those days in the mountains, alone, praying and thinking. He sat on a ridge and looked out over the valley where he'd grown up, where his family still struggled, where life was hard but comprehensible. Somewhere across an ocean, other young men were dying in mud and wire, and the newspapers said it was to defend freedom, to stop tyranny, to protect the innocent. York thought about what would happen if men like him refused to fight, if the Germans won, if tyranny spread unchecked. He thought about Christ driving the money changers from the temple with violence. He thought about loving your neighbor enough to stand between them and harm. When he returned to Camp Gordon, he told Buxton he would fight, but the cost of that decision would haunt him for the rest of his life. The 82nd Division shipped out to France in May 1918. By then, the war had been grinding on for nearly 4 years, and the Western Front was a moonscape of craters, mud, wire, and death. The Germans had launched their spring offensive, trying to break through before American reinforcements could tip the balance. They nearly succeeded. By summer, the Allies were counterattacking, pushing the Germans back through France, and the cost in lives was staggering. York first saw combat in the Saint-Mihiel sector in September. The noise alone was overwhelming. Artillery that shook the earth, machine gun fire that sounded like tearing cloth, screams in German and English and French. He shot German soldiers. He watched friends die. He smelled gas and rot and cordite. At night he wrote letters to Gracie Williams back in Tennessee, and his handwriting shook. He prayed constantly, asking God to forgive him for what he was doing, asking for strength to keep doing it. The men still thought he was odd, too religious, too serious, but they no longer laughed at his rifle. They'd seen what he could do with it. By October 1918, the Allied command was planning the Meuse-Argonne offensive, a massive push designed to break the German lines once and for all. The objective was to capture the Decauville Railroad, cutting German supply lines. Standing in the way was the Argonne Forest, 20 miles of dense woods, ravines, and hills, all fortified by the Germans with machine gun nests, artillery positions, and trench systems built over 4 years. It was a killing ground. The 82nd Division was assigned to capture the Decauville Railroad on a narrow front. On October 7th, Company G moved into position. That night, York couldn't sleep. He sat in a trench, his Springfield across his knees, and cleaned it by candlelight. The ritual was soothing. Disassemble, wipe down every part, check for rust or dirt, reassemble, check the action. Some of the other men played cards. Some wrote letters. Some just stared at nothing. Everyone knew what was coming in the morning. At 6:10 a.m. on October 8, 1918, 17 men from Company G, led by Sergeant Bernard Early, moved out on a mission to take out German machine gun positions that were holding up the division's advance. Alvin York was part of that group. The fog was thick, visibility maybe 30 yards. They moved through underbrush, trying to stay quiet, but the ground was covered in dead leaves and broken branches. Every step sounded too loud. They were somewhere near Hill 223, in a valley south of the Decauville Railroad, when the Germans opened fire. The sound was apocalyptic. 6 machine guns, maybe more, all firing at once from positions on higher ground. The Maxim MG Eero 8 machine gun fired 450 rounds per minute, and in the confined space of the forest ravine, the effect was like being inside a tornado made of lead. Men fell instantly. Sergeant Early took a round through the chest. Corporal Murray Savage was hit in the shoulder. Others died before they could even scream. The survivors dove for cover behind trees, rocks, anything. York hit the ground behind a fallen log and pressed his face into mud that smelled like iron and decay. Bullets splintered the wood above his head. Someone was screaming for a medic. Someone else was crying. York's heart hammered so hard he thought his ribs might crack. This was it. This was where he would die, face down in French mud, killed by weapons that fired faster than any man could react. Except the machine guns couldn't depress their aim low enough to hit men prone on the ground directly below their positions. The Germans had set up their nests for grazing fire across the valley, to catch troops advancing in the open, not for targets this close. It was a small advantage, maybe the only advantage, but it wouldn't last. Soon the Germans would come down with rifles and grenades and finish them off, or they'd simply hold position and wait for the Americans to bleed out. York looked around. Sergeant Early was dead. Corporal Savage was hit but conscious, trying to stop the bleeding. Of the 17 men who'd set out, maybe 9 were still alive, pinned down, unable to move. The machine gun nests were maybe 40 yards uphill, hidden in the brush. York could see muzzle flashes, could hear the mechanical clatter of the guns, but he couldn't see the men operating them. This was the moment when everything he'd learned in the mountains, everything he'd struggled with spiritually, everything that had brought him across an ocean to this muddy hole in France, all converged into a single cold calculation. He couldn't save his friends by staying pinned down. He couldn't save them by retreating. The only way forward was through. York began to crawl. He moved slowly, inches at a time, using every bit of cover, trees, rocks, dead ground. The machine guns were still firing, but they were focused on the main group, trying to suppress them. York worked his way to the left, flanking the German positions. The fog helped. So did the noise. The Germans couldn't hear him moving over the sound of their own weapons. It took him maybe 10 minutes to crawl 30 yards. Then he was past the machine gun's field of fire, below and to the side of the nests. He could see German soldiers now, maybe 25 or 30 of them, manning the guns, passing ammunition, coordinating fire. They were focused downhill, didn't know he was there. York rose to one knee, brought the Springfield to his shoulder, and began to shoot. The first German fell without a sound, hit center mass. The second turned to see what happened and took a round through the throat. York worked the bolt smooth and fast. The motion automatic from 10,000 repetitions on mountain ranges and in basic training. Third target, a German officer, pointing and shouting. The officer dropped. Fourth, a soldier running for cover. He fell mid-stride. The Germans realized they were taking fire from the side. Some of them turned, bringing rifles up. York shot them as they turned. Others dove for cover. York shot them as they dove. He fired as fast as he could work the bolt, and every shot dropped a man. There was no thought, no hesitation, just the mechanical process. Identify target, aim center mass, squeeze trigger, work bolt, next target. In the mountains, this was how you shot a flock of turkeys. You shot the ones in the back first, so the ones in front didn't know to run. A German machine gunner swung his weapon around, trying to bring it to bear on York. York shot him through the head. The man behind him grabbed the gun. York shot him too. A third German lunged for the weapon. York's bullet caught him in the chest. The noise was constant. The crack of his Springfield, the bang of German rifles, men shouting in German, wounded men screaming. York's world narrowed to a tunnel. Target, shoot, bolt, target, shoot, bolt. His shoulder ached from the recoil. His hands moved automatically, muscle memory from a lifetime of hunting. He didn't think about the men he was killing. Thinking would slow him down, and slow meant dead. A group of 6 German soldiers, led by a lieutenant, charged at York with bayonets. They came downhill, running through the brush, screaming. York had maybe 3 seconds. He switched tactics, pulled his M119-01 pistol with his left hand while still holding the rifle, and shot the last man in the charging line first, then the second to last, working forward so the ones in front wouldn't see their comrades falling behind them and wouldn't have time to stop. It was the turkey trick again, applied to men. He dropped all 6 in less than 10 seconds. The lieutenant fell last, shot through the chest at 15 feet, his bayonet inches from York's body. York dropped the pistol, grabbed his rifle, and kept shooting. The machine gun nests were in chaos now. Some Germans were trying to return fire, others were trying to flee. Others were just frozen, unable to process what was happening. York shot them all. He shot men running. He shot men hiding. He shot men trying to surrender. The rage and terror and adrenaline formed a white-hot core in his chest, and his mind retreated somewhere deep inside, somewhere safe, while his body did the work his training and instincts demanded. A German major, Paul Vollmer, commanding the battalion whose machine guns had pinned down York's company, suddenly appeared with several soldiers, hands raised. Vollmer spoke some English. He was bleeding from a wound in his arm. He shouted something over the gunfire, something about surrendering, about ordering his men to stop. York kept his rifle pointed at Vollmer's chest. His finger was still on the trigger. Part of him, the part that remembered being a hellraiser in Tennessee, the part that had killed 6 men with a pistol in 10 seconds, wanted to shoot Vollmer too. But another part, the part that had struggled with faith and duty, the part that still prayed every night, made him lower the rifle an inch and nod. Vollmer shouted orders in German. Slowly, incredibly, German soldiers began to stand up, hands raised. They came out of the machine gun nests, out of trenches, out of cover. 10 men, 20, 30. More kept coming. York kept his rifle up, sweeping it back and forth, his finger on the trigger. Some of the Germans were wounded. Some were crying. Most just looked exhausted and terrified. Corporal Savage and the other surviving Americans staggered up from their positions, rifles ready. They stared at York, at the bodies scattered across the hillside, at the mass of surrendering Germans, and couldn't quite process what they were seeing. Savage, bleeding from his shoulder wound, asked York what the hell had happened. York just shook his head. He didn't have words for it yet. York ordered the German prisoners to pick up their wounded and start marching. Vollmer, speaking through the pain of his wound, helped organize his men. York and the 7 surviving Americans herded the Germans back toward American lines. On the way, they encountered more German positions, and Vollmer, at gunpoint, ordered those men to surrender too. The column of prisoners grew. 50 men, 70, 100. By the time York reached American lines, he had 132 prisoners, including 3 officers. The men in the American trenches stared in disbelief. A patrol of 17 men had gone out. 8 came back bloody and traumatized, with enough prisoners to fill a prison camp. York's uniform was covered in mud and powder residue. His hands were shaking. His face was blank, empty, like he'd left something essential behind in that valley. His brigade commander, Brigadier General Julian Robert Lindsay, personally questioned York. He wanted to know what happened, how one man had captured so many Germans. York tried to explain, but the words felt inadequate. He'd shot men, a lot of men. He'd done exactly what the mountains had trained him to do, what the army had ordered him to do. And the result was bodies scattered across a hillside and a German battalion broken. Lindsay ordered a patrol to go back to the site and count the dead. They came back with numbers that seemed impossible. At least 25 German soldiers killed, all by rifle or pistol fire. Most shot at ranges between 30 and 80 yards. The machine gun nests, all 6 of them, were silenced. The Decauville Railroad was taken later that day. The American advance continued. York was promoted to sergeant. Then he was recommended for the Medal of Honor. Then he became a symbol, a story the army and the newspapers desperately needed. In a war dominated by artillery and gas and machine guns, where individual soldiers were just statistics, where courage often meant nothing more than the willingness to walk into certain death on command, here was a story about one man making a difference. The boy from the Tennessee mountains who became the most deadly soldier in American history, who took on an entire battalion and won. The papers called him a hero. They called him the greatest soldier of the war. York called it the worst day of his life. The killing haunted him. He'd taken lives, and no amount of tactical justification, no medals, no parades could change the fact that he'd violated everything he'd believed before the war. In quiet moments, alone in his tent, he prayed for forgiveness. He prayed for the souls of the men he'd killed. He wondered if God could forgive him, or if he'd damned himself forever by becoming exactly what he'd sworn never to be, a killer. The war ended on November 11th, 1918, just a month after York's action in the Argonne. York came home to America in May 1919, and the country was waiting for him. There were parades, speeches, medals. Marshal Ferdinand Foch of France personally presented him with the Croix de Guerre. General John Pershing called him the greatest soldier in the American Expeditionary Force. Congress awarded him the Medal of Honor. Tennessee gave him a farm and a house. Newspaper reporters followed him everywhere, wanting stories, wanting quotes, wanting to turn him into a legend. York just wanted to go home and forget. He married Gracie Williams and tried to settle into farming. But the farm the state had given him came with debt he hadn't been told about, and he was too honest to dodge it. He refused to profit from his war service, turning down movie deals and sponsorship offers that would have made him wealthy. His faith wouldn't allow it. Making money from killing seemed obscene to him, like selling his soul a second time. The Great Depression hit, and York struggled financially. He tried to help his community, helped establish a school for mountain children, threw himself into charity work. But the nightmares never stopped. He'd wake up sweating, seeing the faces of the men he'd killed, hearing the machine guns, feeling the weight of the rifle in his hands. Gracie would hold him and pray with him. But there were places in York's mind she couldn't reach, places the war had burned into him that would never heal. In 1941, Hollywood finally convinced York to let them tell his story, but only after he was promised the money would go to the Bible school he'd founded. The movie Sergeant York, starring Gary Cooper, became the highest-grossing film of 1941 and won Cooper an Academy Award. It was a sanitized version, heroic and patriotic, the kind of story America needed as it prepared to enter another world war. York attended the premiere and watched himself turned into a symbol. The real York. The man who still woke up screaming, who still prayed for the souls of German soldiers he'd never known, who still wondered if God had forgiven him, wasn't on that screen. When World War II broke out, York tried to enlist again. He was 53 years old, overweight, suffering from health problems. The Army politely declined, but asked him to help with recruiting and morale. He traveled the country, gave speeches, sold war bonds, played the role of hero because his country needed heroes. But in private letters to friends, he expressed deep sorrow about the necessity of another war, about another generation of young men being sent to kill and die. After World War II, York's health declined rapidly. He suffered a stroke in 1954, then another in 1958 that left him partially paralyzed and unable to speak clearly. He spent his last years in a VA hospital in Nashville, wheelchair-bound, struggling with medical bills despite his fame. The man who'd refused to profit from his service died nearly broke. On September 2, 1964, Alvin York passed away at the age of 76. He was buried with full military honors in Pall Mall, Tennessee, in the mountains where he'd learned to shoot. The irony wasn't lost on historians. The greatest American war hero of World War I had spent his last years struggling financially, disabled, and largely forgotten by a nation that had once celebrated him obsessively. The movie had made millions. The toy companies had made millions selling Sergeant York merchandise. But York himself, bound by his faith and conscience, had refused the money and died in debt. What York proved in the Argonne Forest wasn't just about marksmanship or courage, though he demonstrated both in extraordinary measure. He proved that even in the most mechanized industrial war in human history up to that point, individual skill and determination could still matter. 6 machine gun nests, the ultimate symbol of industrial warfare, the weapons that had killed millions across 4 years of trench combat, were silenced by one man with a rifle and the patience to use it correctly. It was an anomaly, a throwback, a moment when the old rules of individual combat briefly reasserted themselves in a war that had supposedly made individual soldiers obsolete. But York also proved something darker. That skill in killing, even when used in defense of others, even when recognized and rewarded by society, comes with a cost the medals and parades never acknowledge. The best soldier is often the one who suffers most deeply from what they've done, because conscience and lethality make uncomfortable roommates in a human soul. York killed to save his friends, and his friends lived. But York paid for those lives with pieces of himself that could never be recovered, with sleep he never got back, with a peace of mind that died in that valley in France. The wars we fight shape us in ways that transcend tactics and technology. They take young men and women and force them to become something other than what they were, something harder and more capable and more broken. Alvin York went into the Argonne Forest as a man of faith struggling to reconcile duty and conscience. He came out as history, as symbol, as the deadliest American soldier of the war. But the cost of that transformation was a lifetime of carrying the weight of lives taken, of wondering if heaven could hold both the man who loved his enemies and the man who'd killed 25 of them in an hour. We remember the medal and forget the price. We remember the victory and forget the nightmares. We remember Sergeant York the hero and forget Alvin York the man, who prayed every night for the souls of his enemies and died still hoping God had forgiven him for doing what his country asked. That's the real story. Not just courage under fire, but the cost of that courage, paid in installments for the rest of a life. The men and women who serve carry weights the rest of us can barely imagine, and they carry them in silence, because the words for that kind of burden don't exist in any language spoken by those who've never been there. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe for more forgotten heroes of World War II and beyond. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and if someone in your family served in any war. Their stories deserve to be remembered too, not just the heroism but the cost, not just the victory but the price. Because every medal has a shadow, and every hero carries scars we can't see.